Grace and peace, Apostle Cheryl Richardson here. Welcome to Judah's Roar Domestic Violence Awareness Initiative YouTube channel. We are going to be talking today about 5 untruths regarding domestic violence. 5 untruths, 5 of them regarding domestic violence. I'm going to give you a couple of seconds to subscribe if you've not done so already. Make sure that you share this video, and yes, you can share it even as you view it. We'll give you a few seconds to do that, and we'll be right back. We're back. Okay, so we're going to be talking about 5 untruths regarding domestic violence. 5. There are more than 5, but we're going to address 5 in this video. And untruth number 1 would be that drugs and alcohol cause domestic violence. Drugs and alcohol cause domestic violence. That's the first untruth that we're going to discuss. Now listen, the presence of drug and alcohol in the system, in the environment, can increase the frequency. It may increase the severity of the domestic violence incident, but it does not cause it. And so because people believe that drugs and alcohol cause it, they then further believe, usually, that the elimination of drugs and alcohol will eliminate the problem of violence. This is absolutely untrue. Absolutely untrue. And so when we embrace this thought that drugs and alcohol cause it, we provide the abuser with an excuse for unacceptable behavior. We provide the victim with a thought process that further victimizes them and causes them to feel that there's something outside of that relationship that is causing the problem. When in fact, the root problem, the root cause of domestic violence, if it has escalated to a physical abuse or not, is an insatiable need on the part of the abuser, whether they be male or female, an insatiable appetite for power and control. They desire absolute power and control over another human being. And that is the root cause of domestic violence, not drug and alcohol use. Domestic violence untruth number 2. Have you ever heard that saying that what happens in this house stays in this house? This has been taught to generations upon generations upon generations of children and young people in an attempt to keep private matters private. So, untruth number 2 is that domestic violence is a private matter. No, it's not. No, it is not. Domestic violence, when it occurs, affects not only the victim, it affects any other family members that may be residing in the home. It affects first responders who may have to respond to a call for help during a time of domestic violence occurring in that household. It affects neighbors who hear it. It affects our educational system. Every system that we have in society is negatively, adversely affected by domestic violence. Our legal system, our criminal justice system, our educational system, our workplaces. There are increased incidents of workplace violence when workers come from a household in which domestic violence does occur. It is not unusual for an abuser to go to the workplace of a victim and wreak violence and havoc there. It's not unusual for children to go to school and not be able to concentrate or to become behavior problems themselves because of the abuse that they're witnessing at home. And so, no, domestic violence is not a private matter. It absolutely has a detrimental effect on all of us. The United Nations declared domestic violence a global pandemic back in 2017. And when they first issued this statement, most people didn't even understand what a pandemic was. And now, due to COVID-19 and the devastating effect it has had on mankind worldwide, we have increased understanding about what a pandemic actually is. So, domestic violence has been described as a pandemic within a pandemic within a pandemic. It is not a private matter. And here's the thing, it breeds, it grows in isolation and in darkness and in secrecy. And for those of you who describe yourself as spiritual or a believer or a Christian, whatever faith you embrace, know that silence is not spiritual. There's nothing deep and mystical about being quiet when someone is being abused. And so, again, untruth number 2, domestic violence is not a private matter. As I stated previously, domestic violence takes a tremendous toll on virtually every aspect of our society. It negatively impacts so many systems that we have put in place in order to lend structure and order. Did you know, were you aware that children who witness abuse, listen, they don't even have to be the direct target of the abuse, but children who witness abuse are 10 times more likely to become abusers or victims themselves. Children who witness abuse are 10 times more likely to become abusers or victims themselves. If you want to look at it from a spiritual standpoint, you could say that the seed of victimization, the seed of abuse has been sown into their lives at a relatively early age. And it makes them vulnerable to becoming an abuser or to becoming a victim themselves. They are 6 times more likely to commit suicide because of the hopelessness that envelops them, because of this pessimistic worldview that they have based on what they've experienced and what they have witnessed. They are 24 times more likely to commit a sexual assault. They are 50% more likely to abuse alcohol or drugs, which then kind of takes us back to untruth number 1, right? That drugs and alcohol cause abuse. They don't cause abuse, they provide an excuse that society all too often accepts for abusive behavior. Children who witness abuse are 74% more likely to commit crimes against others because their sense of boundaries, their sense of right and wrong can be negatively impacted as well. Domestic violence untruth number 3 is that women, victims, even men, if they are victims, provoke the violence against them. This is absolutely absurd. And I'll tell you why. We've already talked about the fact that domestic violence is about power and control. It has absolutely nothing to do with love. Love does not hurt. Love is not unkind. Love is not violent. Love does not hurt intentionally. Okay? Now, the untruth that the victim provokes the violence provides a cover for the abuser. It relieves them of responsibility for their behavior. It relieves them of the responsibility, and it does not hold them accountable for visiting violence, whether it's verbal, emotional, psychological, or physical, upon the victim. Victims are not the cause of the aggression that is used against them. And I would go so far as to say this, even if in an intimate relationship, one partner has violated the vow somehow, they have broken their promise, somehow in the relationship. There are many options that don't involve violence, that do not involve verbal abuse, that do not involve gaslighting, coercive control, manipulation, threats, stalking. Okay, there are other options. Get outside help to resolve the issues within the relationship or leave the situation. But violence of any type, there's no excuse for it. Domestic violence untruth number 4 is this belief that the violence explodes suddenly from out of nowhere. This is categorically untrue. By its very nature, domestic violence is a systematic pattern of behavior with the sole purpose being to exert power and control over the other individual or individuals in the home. Okay. It builds over time, it increases in frequency and in intensity, usually as it escalates. In one household, the pattern may be once a week there's a violent eruption. In another household, it might be once every 6 months, but there's a pattern. There is a systematic pattern of abuse. It is not all of a sudden. There may be times when it presents as a response to something, an angry response to something, but the reality of it is that it's been building over time. It's been building over time. Okay, so it's important to know that a domestic violence incident is not this mysterious explosion that comes from out of nowhere. It is a systematic plan on the part of the abuser to gain and retain control over the victim. To be clear, a domestic violence incident may present as screaming and yelling and breaking things and physical aggression and object aggression, putting fists through walls, damaging household items, or or it can look like a smile on the face and a calm tone of voice and scathing words being used. It can look like a smile on the face, a calm demeanor, feigned control because they're out of control inwardly, and a whispered threat. It doesn't have to be issued with a raised voice or a scowl on the face or steam coming out the ears. It's so important that we understand that. And as stated previously, it is a systematic pattern of behavior that the abuser uses to ensure that they obtain and retain control of the victim. Okay, domestic violence untruth number 5 is that violence and abuse are always physical. Usually, people think of domestic violence in terms of physical or sexual abuse. And actually, it's only been recent years that sexual abuse within the marital relationship was even recognized. Prior to that, many, many years ago, it was believed that there was no such thing as sexual abuse within the confines of a marital relationship. Okay? It's important to know that abuse takes many forms, many different forms. Physical abuse, verbal abuse, sexual abuse, spiritual abuse, emotional abuse, economic or financial abuse, social and psychological abuse. These different forms, these various forms of abuse often coexist within domestic violence riddled relationship. And it's important to remember, as I stated previously, that when we're talking about domestic violence or domestic abuse or intimate partner violence, you're talking about a pattern of behavior, a systematic pattern of behavior, with the focal point being to exercise complete power and control over another human being. Okay? So, the way in which these different forms of abuse coexist um, cut the victim off from their support system, from other healthy relationships, family members. This systematic pattern of behavior that is exhibited by the abuser has the effect often of intimidating the victim, and getting her to even cooperate, or him, if the victim is a male, to cooperate with being cut off from support systems, from family members, from co-workers, from those who attend the same house of worship, for example. But it cuts them off from receiving any help or sharing with anyone the full extent of what they are experiencing in that situation. If the victim is dealing with financial abuse, and this is almost always the case, then their ability to be financially independent and to change the direction of their life and to build a better life are paralyzed, are cut off. And so it's important to know that the violence and abuse that take place in a domestic violence situation are not limited to physical abuse and sexual assault. Over time, the coercive control tactics, the manipulations, the gaslighting serve to diminish the victim's sense of self. A healthy sense of self worth is deteriorating, and hopelessness can set in. So, domestic violence untruth number 5 is that violence and abuse are always physical or sexual. Okay, so we've talked about 5 untruths. We've identified 5 untruths, although there are many more. We've talked about 5 specific untruths regarding domestic violence. Untruth number 1 is that drugs and or alcohol cause domestic violence. Untruth number 2 is that domestic violence is a private matter. What happens in this house stays in this house. Untruth number 3, that the victims provoke the violence against them. Untruth number 4 is that domestic violence and abuse come out of nowhere, exploding suddenly. Okay? And untruth number 5 is that violence and abuse are always physical. We hope that you have learned something today, have had your mindset refreshed, have a slightly different perspective of domestic violence. It's so important that we identify what's not true, because these untruths only serve to further isolate victims and increase their susceptibility to hopelessness because of the ongoing maltreatment, the gaslighting, being isolated and cut off from others, having a diminished sense of self, not understanding that they do, in fact, matter. This is Apostle Cheryl L. Richardson with Judah's Roar Domestic Violence Awareness Initiative. We do have a closed Facebook group called Dominion Over Domestic Violence. It is faith based. If you feel that this might be beneficial to you or someone you know, do send us a request to join. And we will be back with you next week with a new video. Stay safe out there. Blessings to you.